and not trying to prove myself and battle and pretend to be street, you know what I mean, and pretend that I'm going to survive, because I'm not. I'm going to get it very, very soon if things carry on like this.
Cambridge graduate Mark Blanco lies dying in the street as Pete Doherty runs off, followed by his minder Johnny Headlock.
I don't know.
This is the moment he falls from the balcony. How and why remains a mystery.
Oh, what became of the likely lad?
The Libertines are one of the greatest and most interesting bands to come out of the early 2000s. They're also one of the wildest bands I've ever made a video on. This wilderness can all be credited to the frontman of the band, Pete Doherty, who may or may not have gotten into a lot of trouble with the police for his interesting hobbies. Because of this, Pete got a bit of a reputation in the British press and basically became the Sid Vicious of the noughties. This constant attention by the media would only make things worse for Pete and his habits, and it reached the point where he even got a person both in 2006 and in 2010. As crazy as that sounds, there's obviously way more to the story than just some news articles and drunken interviews, and I also want to talk about the music of the Libertines. So without further ado, make sure to subscribe if you want to know more about indie bands, and enjoy. This is the insane story of the Libertines and Pete Doherty. The Libertines were formed in 1997 by Pete Doherty and Carl Barrett. Carl used to share a flat with Pete's sister, so the two eventually met and decided to form a band together. Both Pete and Carl abandoned their college courses and decided to give full attention to their music careers. Now, this decision was a bit easier for Pete than Carl. See, Carl was raised in a divorced family and spent most of his years living with his mom in a commune, while Pete, on the other hand, was raised in a very comfortable middle-class family and even got accepted to Oxford. None of this obviously matters that much. Neither Pete or Carl chose what family they were going to be born in. There's this idea that Pete Doherty had a tough upbringing, which explains everything he did in the 2000s, which, you know, it doesn't.
Pete wants everyone to think that he grew up the tough drug dealing kid, that, you know, he's been there in the depths of scourge of society and he knows where you're coming from, and it's crap. You know, he comes from a very, very comfortable middle class background.
Anyways, why am I mentioning all of this? Because the fact that Pete had a good upbringing made for him to have a passion for poetry at a very young age. He even won a poetry competition at the age of 16 and was actually going to go to Oxford for literature. This talent of his was going to become very, very clear on the Libertines' discography. In March 2000, after John Hassell had also joined the group, the band met their second manager, Benny Pucci. Benny got the band to record a demo set of 8 songs called Legs 11. On this demo set, you can hear one of the early versions of the iconic Libertines song, Music When the Lights Go Out. I had to cut this off from the original script, but as you can see, Pete was really inspired by the Britpop scene. When asked in the interviews about his inspirations, he has repeatedly mentioned Suede, Oasis, and older bands that have inspired the Britpop and Manchester scene, like the Velvet Underground and the Smiths. Any genre I mention on this channel always leads back to these two bands. Anyways, here's a video of young Pete talking about Oasis.
Can you sum up Oasis for me in one sentence? Yeah, well, I subscribe to the Umberto Eco view that Noel Gallagher's a poet and Liam's a town crier. And I've always, sorry about that, I've always seen that as a perfect combination, you know?
The fact that the band had such great tracks on their very first demo showed that there was a lot of potential there. Despite their amazing songwriting, the Libertines only got signed after the success of another iconic 2000s band. This band, of course, being The Strokes. Now, different from the Arctic Monkeys, the Libertines were not inspired by the Strokes. I don't think Carl even liked them as much as Pete did. But the Strokes showed the band that there was a market for this type of music. Rock wasn't dead just yet. So they got back their manager, they recruited Gary Powell on drums, and in the next 6 months, all they did was just write songs for their debut album. On the 1st of October 2001, they played for James Endicott from Rough Trade. This showcase was played without their bassist because he was high on life. Thankfully, James got them a second chance to play for the heads of the label, Geoff Travis and Janet Leigh. And on the 21st of December 2001, the Libertines were officially signed to Rough Trade. The band slowly started to gather more and more attention in the indie scene, before they even released their first album. This happened because they were supporting big names like the Vines and the Strokes. And just like with the Strokes, NME fucking loved the Libertines. With this newly gained attention, the band released their first ever single, What a Waster.
What a waster, what a fucking waster, you pissed it all up the wall and round
That single was what brought them their first ever NME appearance. 3 months later, they released their second album single, and on the 21st of October 2002, the Libertines released their debut album, Up the Bracket. Up the Bracket is an amazing debut album, and is generally one of my favorite albums to come out of the 2000s. The whole album sounds so raw and genuine, but like in a Libertines kind of way. And this isn't just the production or the guitar, but even Pete's voice sounds almost drunk. It gives you that feeling of a night out with your friends, and along with the amazing lyricism, it works perfectly. It's nice to go back and listen to this album, considering how polished and clean everything became after the 2000s. Despite the indie sleaze scene becoming very overcrowded at the time, the Libertines managed to stand out among all of that and created their own sound, which still holds up to this day. You can go back and listen to songs like Time for Heroes, Up the Bracket, Tell the King, or frankly any song in that record, and you'll see that they're full of emotion and they sound amazing. They're not just a random indie band, they're the Libertines. Also, something that doesn't get mentioned a lot in my opinion is how influential this band was. Everyone likes to talk about the Strokes, which I understand because they're very important, but bands like the Arctic Monkeys and the Cooks are very clearly inspired by the Libertines, down to the sound of their guitars or their way of singing. But all of this gets overshadowed by Pete's negative press, or by the fact that these bands ended up becoming even bigger than the Libertines. I don't know if this whole rant is making sense to all of you, but go listen to the Libertines if you haven't. They're timeless, and I think they deserve more credit for shaping the UK indie scene. Now, did Up the Bracket perform well on the charts? Yeah, it did alright. It got number 35, but would later get even more recognition because of the band's later work, and also the fact that Pete had turned into a celebrity more than a rock star. But before we talk about how Pete turned into a celebrity, we need to go back and see how this whole thing started. Okay, from now on, there's gonna be a lot of censoring I have to do, because God forbid I talk about anything serious on YouTube. If I want this video to stay up and not be age restricted, I have to start using terms like white sugar or brown sugar. Very creative, I know, but look at Pete Doherty now. I bet he loves all types of sugar. Also, you have to hear this because there's no way in hell I'm unironically saying unaliving in this channel. By 2002, Pete had started using both white and brown sugar, something that Carl Barrett was definitely not a fan of. Still, the band wasn't at the point of a breakup yet, and they even did a US tour where they recorded a bunch of future Libertines and Baby Shambles songs. What's Baby Shambles, you ask? I'll explain that later. After that US tour, the band went back home and Pete's problem began to grow larger, so the rest of the band was growing even more distant from him. Despite that, on the 18th of August, the band released the biggest song of their career, the single Don't Look Back Into the Sun. The song's title was inspired by Oasis and the Velvet Underground, and it turned into an indie anthem of the time, to the point where it even appeared on the first episode of the In-Betweeners. By the way, people on my Discord have been asking for a video on the In-Betweeners soundtrack, link in my bio for both the Discord and the Patreon. Will that be something you guys would be interested in? Did you see how small the Discord plug was? You gotta give me some credit for that. Anyways, after the release of Don't Look Back Into the Sun, trouble began for the band, or more specifically for Pete. While the band was on a Japan tour, Pete had broken into Carl's apartment because he had asked him to either clean up himself or leave the band. I guess Pete chose the latter one, or the band chose it for him, because they kicked him out of the band without him even knowing they did so. He had to find out through the news.
And yes, it hurt, but only because... Alright, truthfully then.
Yeah.
Because no one told me to my face. I heard about it on the radio, I read about it in a newspaper, I've been kicked out of the band. That was the only thing.
This was the start of Pete Doherty's long list of controversies with the British media. At this point, he was already well into his sugar problems, to the point where he was wasting $200 a day on them. On the 7th of September 2003, Pete Doherty got sentenced to 6 months in jail for breaking and entering. The sentence later got reduced to 2 months. This was not gonna be the only time he'd see himself in jail. Despite all that, Carl managed to make up with Pete after he got released, and the two immediately went back to performing together. This performance was dubbed by the fans as the Freedom Gig. Things would not be all butterflies and rainbows from then though, because Pete would later become friends with a local poet nicknamed Wolfman. Wolfman was also known to really love the brown sugar, and Carl, along with everyone around Pete, fucking hated him. And I don't really blame Carl for all of this, because Wolfman was the last thing Pete needed at this point. The band changed their manager and hired Alan McGee, the guy who discovered both Oasis and Slowdive. Because of Wolfman and a million other reasons, Pete would go back to using the brown sugar, which led to the band getting into constant fights with each other. This tension would all be channeled into their second studio album, The Libertines. The Libertines really deserve to be the self-titled album, because the main theme of it is the band itself. Songs like Can't Stand Me Now, What Became of the Likely Lads, What Katie Did, and The Saga are all about Pete's and Carl's relationship. It's a really unique record because despite Pete and Carl hating each other, the songs are very complete and tell their story very clearly. Despite the fact that they had to use literal security to keep the band from fighting with each other, and later Pete left the production to the rest of the band, this record actually came out pretty good. So good that it became the band's biggest album to date. The Libertines got #1 on the UK charts in their first week, and Can't Stand Me Now got #2 on the singles chart. The album also includes iconic songs of the band like What Became of the Likely Lads, What Katie Did, Music When the Lights Go Out, and more. To this day, I can't really decide if this album is better than their debut, but I think they both serve very different purposes. The cover of the self-titled album is actually a picture from the Freedom gig I mentioned earlier. Even though it looks like they're about to take some needles again, it's actually Pete and Carl showing off the Libertines tattoos they did together in the US. Despite their success, Pete's and Carl's relationship was way beyond recovery, and Pete ended up leaving the band before the record was even released. And this time, it seemed he left them for good. The reason for this leave was of course his problems. In May of 2004, Pete was admitted to the Priory, where he tried to overcome his addiction twice, failing both of those times. The last gig the band would play was at Carl Barrett's nightclub, where he promised them he would go to Thailand and get clean. The Libertines told him that he was welcome to rejoin the band as soon as he would clean up his act. This of course didn't happen for quite a long time, and on the 17th of December 2004, the Libertines played their final gig without Pete Doherty. Pete Doherty with the Libertines was certainly a troubled man, but at least he had some people who were holding him by the reins. Pete Doherty without the Libertines was a whole other story, and this story unfortunately got picked up bit by bit by the British press. They had finally found someone they could dig their claws on, and they did not seem to let go anytime soon. Now, do you remember that other band I talked about, Baby Shambles? Well, contrary to the Libertines, they welcomed Pete with open arms despite his sugar problems. They of course did this because this was Pete's band that he had formed after the Libertines kicked him out in 2003. I'm not gonna get into the Baby Shambles discography, but what I do want to focus on is Pete Doherty after the Libertines. Because of his constant problems with the law, Pete had turned into more of a celebrity than a musician. This unfortunately made him more famous than any Libertines song. 5 years with the band and 2 incredible records, and the peak of his career would come because of the brown sugar. Pete Doherty thrown off 20 million baht for smoking and nearly blowing it up. Ex-Libertines frontman arrested for assault. I'll talk about that one later. Pete Doherty chasing the dragon. This whole attention that Pete was getting would also be translated to attention for Baby Shambles, and my god did they go off the rails. They were selling out shows every night, and Pete had no intention of quitting the brown sugar anytime soon.
That gig we did in Blackpool, he leant over my drums in the first song, he was crying. Help me, Gemma, help me. And I can't do anything. And you're falling asleep, and there's kids, I can see the front row, and they're crying, and they're looking at him like that. They'd come to see Peter. I put on a show, not see Peter fall asleep and dribbling and falling over and forgetting words.
This media attention would reach its ultimate peak after Pete Doherty started very publicly dating Kate Moss. By 2005, Pete wasn't known as the ex-Libertines frontman, or not even the Baby Shambles frontman. He was known as Kate's junkie boyfriend. Yes, that is the actual word the British press used multiple times to describe him. From now on, every time he would get into trouble, the press would say Kate's boyfriend did this and that, and Pete loved getting into trouble. By 2011, he had been jailed for his 26th charge. He also dated Amy Winehouse around 2009, but then didn't get any attention from the press, seeing how it was a private relationship. I can't really talk about everything Pete did throughout these years, because this video would be 3 hours long, but I'm gonna focus on his 3 most serious offenses, or as I like to call this segment, Pete Doherty's victims. Starting off with Max Carlish. Max Carlish was a failed director who was looking to make a name for himself again by making a documentary on Pete Doherty. Max was also really fucking weird.
I will try and seduce you, and we may have intercourse, but you know, there won't be any involved, you know?
His documentary was called Stalking Pete Doherty, and I somehow managed to find it online, even though he took it down from YouTube and everything else. He actually started this documentary before Pete even started dating Kate Moss. Half of it was just sucking up to Pete and everyone making fun of him on stage.
Get off, you fat.
Later Pete got colder with him because he wasn't even asking any real questions. was just standing around filming him. During his time filming, he got a video of Pete doing some brown sugar. Seeing how his documentary was going to shit and he desperately needed some money, he sold this footage to the news, and the next day, pictures of Pete doing brown sugar were on the front pages of multiple magazines. Pete learned about this and ended up punching Mark in the eye and going to jail for assault. This of course caused even more tabloids to mention his name. Pete's second victim was none other than the reason why this video got titled the way it did. In December of 2006, during one of Pete's parties, Mark Blanco fell from the balcony of Pete's building. Pete and everyone else at that party saw this and decided to just run away without calling anyone. For years this case got dismissed as an accident, but in 2023 there was a documentary that got released called Pete Doherty, Who Killed My Son. In this documentary, Mark Blanco's mom talks about how she believes that her son's death wasn't actually an accident, but he was indeed pushed from the balcony. She doesn't claim that Pete pushed him, but she's certain that someone on that party did. A lot of people have watched this documentary and have claimed that Pete has blood in his hands. Even if he wasn't the one to push Mark, he's definitely guilty for creating that whole situation or environment. But there's one more person that people forget to talk about when they mention Pete, and that person is Doherty's third victim, Robin Whitehead. Robin Whitehead was a photographer and a filmmaker and was actually the daughter of another filmmaker called Peter Whitehead. Robin had decided to make a film about Pete Doherty, something that one of Pete's old friends had advised her not to do. Still, she got close to Pete and Wolfman, and she started making her film. This film would never see the light of day though, because on the 24th of January 2010, Robin had been pronounced dead due to an overdose. She died on Wolfman's apartment while filming Pete and his friends. Later, both Pete and Wolfman got arrested, Pete for his third time, for possession of Class A drugs. The footage that Robin had filmed were all used in court against the two of them, and the film never got to reach the public eye. I'd imagine that even if it did, it would be very disturbing to show anywhere. Robin or Mark or Max were not the only people to be harmed around Pete Doherty. God knows how many undocumented stuff have happened at these parties. But I don't think you can point a finger at a single person for all of this. You can't point the finger at Pete or Wolfman or fucking Carl, because that's just how these environments are. As I said in the intro, I'm not making this video to shame Pete Doherty. The British media did that for years, and it only made everything worse. I want him to be an example of what can happen if you let yourself go and give in to those stuff. Still, Pete Doherty somehow managed to survive all those years alive, and in 2010 he got back with the Libertines. The band wasn't still fully back together, but in 2010 they played some reunion shows for the Reading and Leeds festival. 4 years later, the band would get back together again. This time, they were back for good. The band was doing shows all around the country, and in January 2015, it was announced that Doherty had successfully completed his rehab treatment at the Hope Rehab Center in Thailand. 1 year later, on the 11th of September 2015, the band released their third studio album, Anthems for Doomed Youth. The album peaked at number 3 on the charts and featured iconic songs of the bands like Gunga Din and You're My Waterloo. This album was actually announced in Glastonbury 2015, and it got a pretty good response from the fans, despite not being as commercially successful as their two other albums. In 2019, Pete got arrested again in France for trying to get a hold of the white sugar, but it seems like that was just a moment of weakness for him. Since then, Pete has been clear from all substances, as much as the public is aware at least, and in April of this year, the band released their fourth studio album, All Quiet in the Eastern Esplanade. The album reached number 1 on the UK charts, and it's probably my favorite album to come out this year. I recommend everyone to go check it out because in my opinion it's really underrated. Also, with this new album, the band also opened a hotel/nightclub called the Albion Rooms. This hotel is featured on the cover of their record and is of course a reference to their humble beginnings. That was all I had to say for the Libertines. Make sure to like and subscribe because I spent way too much time going through what Pete did in the 2000s. I hope you guys liked this video and check out my other band videos. Discord and Patreon are linked down below. Thank you very much. Goodbye.